Ukrainian and Russian delegations may sit down for direct talks for the first time since 2022, this time with US involvement. Neither Putin nor Trump will attend the negotiation in Turkey, but the outcome will undoubtedly shape both the war and the wider geopolitical balance. And while preparations are underway, Russia spent the night launching drone strikes on Ukrainian cities. So what signals is Moscow really sending right now? And how are Ukraine's partners reacting? We'll ask Ukraine's ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Myroshnychenko. Vasyl, welcome to the studio of Channel 24.
Hi, Natalia.
So one thing we know for sure, Putin won't come to the talks. He won't speak directly with the President Volodymyr Zelensky. From your perspective, what kind of message does that send to the world, to Ukraine?
I think it's very simple. The message is straightforward. President Putin is not interested in peace. He's interested in continuing to wage war. Just to remind our audience, as of 11th of March, President Trump has offered a ceasefire to Ukraine and Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky has accepted the ceasefire, and Russians never agreed to that. More so, following this last weekend and the visit of 4 European leaders to Ukraine, both Britain, France, Germany, and Poland, and together with Ukraine, they have drafted and issued a declaration. They have consulted President Donald Trump before issuing that, where they have demanded an immediate ceasefire, unconditional immediate ceasefire from Russia, and Russia never agreed to that. More so, Putin said that he's interested in talking to Ukraine directly. And this is where President Zelensky has responded and said, I'm happy to do it. Let's do it soon. Let's do it this week. And he announced that he's ready to have that meeting in Turkey. And now he's in Turkey. But it doesn't look like Putin is showing up. So Putin did not accept the ceasefire, and he hasn't done it for almost 2 months. He is not showing up to the negotiations he claimed he wanted to do. And thirdly, he keeps on shelling Ukraine, sending missiles, sending drones, killing Ukrainians, and destroying our infrastructure, destroying schools and hospitals. But he is not accepting the ceasefire, or he's not negotiating in good faith. I think it's pretty straight. It's pretty clear. He's going to pretend he will negotiate. He will pretend to negotiate, which he always does, because as you see his statements, he's always saying that he's ready to negotiate, and his spokesperson is repeating the same line. But we don't see it happening. As you know, Ukraine had around 300 different rounds of negotiations in the past 11 years, and those negotiations did not go anywhere. Because when Russians negotiate, they only negotiate, and what they want is Ukraine's surrender. They want Ukraine's surrender, they want Ukraine's annexation and acknowledgement of the annexed territories, they want limited Ukrainian armed forces, they want commitment from our Western allies and partners that they do not supply defense assistance to Ukraine. So practically, the only thing the Russians are ready to negotiate is Ukraine's surrender.
Yes, but could it be a problem that Ukraine is the only country represented at the presidential level there in Turkey? Isn't there a risk that President Volodymyr Zelensky will be pushed to talk to people who can't even, who are not on the high level, who are not making decisions? I'm talking about Russian representatives.
But from what I understand, Zelensky is not going to see the delegation. Now it's a matter if President Zelensky today, and probably maybe the decision was made as we speak, to decide to send an equivalent delegation who would include his foreign policy advisor, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Deputy Minister of Defense. You have to understand that in the diplomatic protocol, the level of the delegation has to be equal. So it's only the matter if those same people would be counterparts from Ukraine who represent it. But still, President still has to make a decision if he does send a Ukrainian delegation for those talks.
Yes. Just a few more questions about Turkey, and then we will move on. Is there any concern that Russia will once again, demand from us the same things they asked for in 2022. A neutral Ukraine, limits on our army, no NATO, Russian is a second language, all of which are completely unacceptable for Ukraine. And then they will blame Ukraine for, not wanting peace. Is that a trap from your perspective?
It's very likely they will do so. Most so, they probably will take the same tax they offered us in the spring of 2022, which was what you just now described, and could be equal to Ukraine's losing our own sovereignty. And they will just be coming up with all those outlandish demands, not being realistic, and realizing perhaps that Ukraine cannot accept it. Not a single Ukrainian leader is able to accept it. More so, those terms would not be acceptable for the Ukrainian people who have sacrificed so much. Ukraine has been courageously fighting for the past 3 years. And for every Ukrainian, it's a matter of not only justice, which is very important, by the way, in this particular case, because every Ukrainian wants to see justice, wants to see Russia accountable for what they've done in Ukraine, seeing Russia responsible and held accountable for the war crimes, for the crimes against humanity, for the crime of aggression. And the only time when Russia will negotiate with Ukraine is when it's weakened. And the way how we can weaken Russia is we should further isolate Russia, impose more sanctions on their oil industry, on their banking sector, their nuclear sector, more defense assistance for Ukraine. I think that's crucial. And of course, using the immobilized Russian assets for the benefit of Ukraine. So $300 billion of Russian sovereign assets must be used for Ukraine's defense. We should be able to buy weapons in America, in Europe, in Australia, using that money to protect Ukraine. And then we should also be able to use those funds to rebuild Ukraine. And therefore, it's when we take it all together, and I think this is when Russia will be able to negotiate. Otherwise, they will pretend they're doing it, but they will never do it in good faith. What's important is to make sure that we maintain our unity of the US, of Europe, of Australia, and other in New Zealand as well. As you know, I'm an ambassador to New Zealand, and New Zealand is part of the coalition of the willing, along with Australia and the democracies. Because this is not just a war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, it's an assault on liberal democracies. And we see how other countries are assisting Russia, how North Korea is assisting Russia, how Iran is assisting Russia, and how many other countries are also assisting Russia. And that's much. A lot is at stake, and a lot is at stake for the democratic world, for the European Union, for all the European nations, and of course, in my part of the world, when I'm currently based in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, you mentioned New Zealand and Australia and coalition of the willing. Vasyl, do you think that this alliance is possible to deter Russia and stop Russia? Is it enough?
What's going to deter Russia is actually when we have a very strong army, strong economy. And to achieve it, we need to make sure that Ukraine has the right weapons, has the right ammunition. We also have enough of the air defense systems or long-range capabilities, strong conventional capabilities, which should be located on the territory of Ukraine, potentially boots on the ground. I think this is what's going to deter Russia. Russia is not deterred by weakness. When Russia sees weakness, they jump on it. And therefore, it's important that we not only demonstrate it, but we are able to deliver it. And it's, of course, work in progress. And most importantly, we should maintain that unity of our allies and partners. Because we have to remember, Ukraine has a super strength. And our super strength is that we will keep on fighting no matter what, because we understand we don't have alternative. Because the alternative is to live under the Russian occupation. And we know what it means to live under the Russian occupation. It means gross violation of human rights. It means torture. It means rape. It means interrogations. It means that Ukrainian identity is wiped out on the territories that Russians control. It's forced citizenship, Russian citizens, as passports are imposed on the Ukrainian people. As you know, people cannot have access to public services such as healthcare or education. They cannot sell their property if they don't have a Russian passport. So all of this has elements of a genocide against the Ukrainian people, and 20% of Ukrainian territory is under the Russian occupation. So we are fighting not for the land, we are fighting for the Ukrainian people. We need to free them, and we rely on our allies and partners to help us achieve it. And certainly, it's not an easy one, because these Russians have deployed 650,000 troops on the territory of Ukraine. They have a bigger population, certainly, but they're not stopping. But for us, we can't stop either, because if we stop, we're going to be totally subdued. We will stop existing as a sovereign nation. We have to remember that when Vladimir Putin wrote that essay and published it on the Kremlin's website in 2021, he was pretty open about what he wants to achieve. He said that Ukraine does not exist, Ukraine is Russia, and Russia should take over Ukraine. So he was pretty clear. I don't think he was taken seriously, but then he went on a mission to deliver his plan, and he was stopped. And he was stopped by the Ukrainian people who were willing to die and who stopped those tanks rolling in. And certainly that was the ammunition and weapons that we got from our partners, javelins that we got from America, including the javelins we got under President Trump. As you know, he authorized the sale of javelins to Ukraine. We couldn't get them under President Obama, and we got them. And then also NLAWs, which were provided by Britain, as well as some of the Stingers, which were provided by some of the Baltic nations. You know, those NLAWs, javelins, and Stingers were essential in our ability to stop the Russian tanks rolling in, to shoot down Russian military helicopters, bring in paratroopers to Kyiv as the war broke out on the 24th of February. I was still in Ukraine, actually, on that day, as many of other Ukrainians. I was still in Kyiv, and I always repeat it, because we have to go back to the basics, how it all started, because it's been over 3 years, but I will never forget that moment when I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning with my 5-year-old son, with my 18-year-old daughter, and my wife, realizing that Russians were landing 30-minute drive from the place where we live. And I often share this story with my friends in Australia and New Zealand, saying, I wish you never have that experience that I had, because we as human beings, we feel safety for our own life. Probably many are ready to die. But when you think about your kids, realizing that enemy troops are literally landing 30-minute drive from the place where you live, I don't wish anybody to go through that experience. All Ukrainians have gone through that. In Kyiv, in other cities where Russians were shelling, sending missiles, and we had to do something. We had to take our families to safety, and hence all those people fleeing Ukraine, going to Europe, and just going through that period of time. It was only months later that I came as an ambassador to Australia, and I was able to go back to Ukraine not 8 times in that 3 years. And every time I go to Ukraine, I talk to people, and I try to gauge the sentiment of how it is. And yes, it's not easy. Ukraine is fighting, and you can feel the fatigue because it's 3 years now. But everybody realizes there is no alternative, and that's where we are.
Yeah, you're right. 3 years of war, it's a lot, and nobody deserves to live under such circumstances. Vasyl, what do you think? How do you see it? Can we or could we see a new military alliance, not only political, but a military forming to maybe replace NATO, maybe not to replace NATO, but to be alongside it?
Unfortunately, there's no alternative under current circumstances. What we need to make sure that America stays committed to Europe, because this is what defines transatlantic security, and that's been a backbone of that security since 1949, since it was established, and therefore, a lot of that is still dependent on American leadership, and it's existential for Ukraine to make sure that America and Europe stay together. They are supporting Ukraine jointly, as well as supported by other like-minded countries like Australia and New Zealand, who are contributing as much as they can. And of course, for me as an ambassador to both of these countries, it's a top priority: defense assistance for Ukraine, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, energy support. I'm working here with the governments in Australia and New Zealand, making sure they understand what challenges Ukraine faces, making sure they understand what are the implications for the Indo-Pacific, and what is at stake, actually. And, recently I've come up to an argument that basically both New Zealand and Australia have skin in the game, because the way this war is going to play out will define security architecture globally, but especially it will define how things develop here in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, because authoritarian leaders are watching how this is unfolding, and they may very well replicate what Russians have done. And of course, if a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which has nuclear weapons, can change borders by force, other countries may actually take a lead and do the same thing. And it actually opens up a new world. It's a jungle world where might is right, and it is dog kind of environment. And in this environment, countries here in the Indo-Pacific, they have no chance of surviving. Only those that have nuclear weapons have a chance. Otherwise, you become a prey, and a big dog is going to eat a small dog. And it's a dangerous world. So we all relied on a rules-based international system for a long time, and Australia and New Zealand have benefited from that. The problem with Australia and New Zealand, they don't have NATO, because at least European nations rely on NATO for their security, and NATO, which security is guaranteed by the US. And of course, we need to make sure that America remains committed, because this is kind of a dream for Russia. What Russia is trying to achieve that America abandons Europe, that EU starts scrambling and dismantling. You've heard, Orban saying that Putin asked him, "When are you leaving the EU?" I mean, it's Putin's dream. America abandoning Europe, EU falling apart, and actually Russia taking over Eastern Europe, taking over Baltic nations, attacking Romania, Poland, and other countries. Because if America abandons Europe, there is no NATO. Yeah. And there is no NATO, there is no protection. Mm-hmm. And in a way, you realize that Russians now have over 220 brigades combat ready. Ukraine has about 120 brigades, which are combat ready and fighting. The whole Europe has only 80 brigades, and they're not combat ready. They don't have the experience we have, just because they don't have the war. But can they get protection? Can they protect themselves without America? And that's a good question to ask. Can European defense industry produce what the defense of different countries needs, what defense departments need? Probably not. I mean, they all rely on American manufacturers. And that's another issue. And you cannot ramp up defense production that quickly. Europe needs another decade or more to actually increase their defense industry.
And what was the reaction of Australia when you saw the Chinese leader were coming to Moscow on the 8th and 9th of May? I mean, what was your perception of what was happening in Moscow back then?
Australia is concerned, but you have to keep in mind that Australia geopolitically is kind of in a difficult situation, because on one hand, the key market for Australia, as for many other countries in the world, I think there are 85 different countries who totally depend on the Chinese market, or who have China as the biggest trading partner. But at the same time, on the security side, the key ally for Australia is the US. So in any fight, even if it's just an economic fight between China and the US, Australia is going to suffer. Even we've seen this even in this recent tension over the tariffs that Americans have been imposing in different countries, including on China. Australian businesses are suffering because it becomes very unpredictable. And if American sanctions are imposed on China, or more tariffs are imposed on China, China will consume less. If China consumes less, they're going to buy not much of Australian iron ore. And Australia entirely depends on primarily on iron ore markets, depends on China. They also sell to Korea, they sell to Japan, but the volume which goes to China is huge. But it's also about shale gas, about other minerals, about agricultural commodities. And Australian economy is commodity driven. I mean, 50% of the revenue comes from the commodity sales. So commodity prices are very vulnerable to these geopolitical, geoeconomic risks. So in any tension or a big, kind of competition for the global dominance between America and China, Australia is in a very precarious situation because it may suffer.
Yeah, but how can Australia help Ukraine to speed up the path to peace? You know, I recently was talking to Australian general, and I know that, Australia sent to Ukraine a lot of bushmasters and keeps sending them again and again and helping Ukrainian army. But what else Australia can do to help us?
Australian support to date is about $1 billion US. So far, primarily it is in military assistance, which have included 120 Bushmasters, 49 M1 Abrams tanks, howitzers, drones, also 56 of M13, which are armored personnel carriers, ammunition, and other equipment that's been provided and supplied to Ukraine. They've sent humanitarian assistance, economic assistance through the EBRD, contributed $30 million to the Europe Energy Support Fund. So Australian government, we have bipartisan support here, both the Labour government as well as the coalition of conservative parties. They're very supportive of Ukraine. It's been maintained like that for the past 3 years. We continue having that support. Elections just took place in Australia. Labour Party got a landslide victory and preserved the power. The top 3 leaders of the country, Prime Minister, visited Ukraine for the first time in our bilateral history in July of 2022. Last year, Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister Rich Marles came to Ukraine in April. Foreign Minister Penny Wong visited Ukraine in December of last year. We also had a visit from a shadow Foreign Minister, Simon Birmingham. Senator Simon Birmingham visited Ukraine in August. So last year, we had 3 senior level visits to Australia, to Ukraine from Australia. And we've never had such a great relationship with Australia in our history. And I'm humbled to be part of this historic developments, to be frank. And Australia, the way Australia can help, answering your question, they can continue supporting Ukraine. They can continue exerting pressure on Russia. They could continue supporting us multilaterally. As you know, I'm also covering 8 Pacific islands here, and Australia has a great deal of clout here in the Pacific. And as you know, every Pacific nation has a vote in the UN. So support of actually Australia and New Zealand here in the Pacific is crucial for us, and we engage on this multilateral level with both Australia and New Zealand quite a lot, asking them for their advocacy in the region. And that's crucial. We should maintain it, and we'll continue working with them very closely on this. But also, generally, Australians don't like bullies, and Putin is a bully. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Australian people have reacted very strongly. And even if you look some of the recent surveys, I mean, we have a majority support for Ukraine. It was over 70% of the population. It was one of the recent surveys several months ago who support more military assistance for Ukraine. When the war broke out 3 years ago, it was like 86%. Now it's like in 70 something, which is still very high. And therefore, our politicians in Australia and the leadership of the country realize it. Hence, they are supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, but what about now? Is it all this peace process on the radars right now? Among Australians?
As you know, both Australians and New Zealand, they're all part of the coalition of the willing. So both countries, though they're not NATO members, have said that they are ready to support potential deployment of their troops to Ukraine should there be a ceasefire, should there be a clear framework created. So they have participated from the very beginning, and they joined immediately. I mean, as soon as the invitation came from the leaders of Britain and France, they have joined that call. and they have remained there. I mean, last Saturday, both of the prime ministers from New Zealand and Australia have tuned into that high-level meeting, which was done from Ukraine, and that's important. And I think this is a clear demonstration of that Anzac spirit, as I often talk about here. Anzac is an Australian New Zealand military corps, which was deployed during the First World War under the British leadership to Gallipoli in Turkey. And in 1915, they were totally defeated in Gallipoli. So for Australians and New Zealanders, it was a very sad page in the history, but that was the experience which have shaped them as sovereign nations, which have helped them shape them as independent countries in a way, because through that Anzac experience, both Australia and New Zealand realized they want to have more independence, they want to have more sovereignty, and there was also that very kind of nation branding or nation, the search of a nation in a way as a separate entity of Australians or identityless, so to say. So that Anzac experience recently, they just marked on the 25th of April, it was 110 years since Anzac, and Anzacs continue shaping modern day Australia and New Zealand. By the way, this is the main national holiday in these countries at the moment, not only commemorating those who died in the First World War, but who died in the Second World War, in all other wars where either New Zealand or Australian troops were deployed. But it's even gone beyond that. I mean, there's a little bit of controversy in both countries about their national days, both in Australia and New Zealand. A lot of that is related to the colonial past of these two countries. So therefore, Anzac becoming the main national holiday. And in a way, our experience that Ukraine is going through is very similar to that Anzac experience, because it was through Russia's invasion of Ukraine 11 years ago that there was a birth of a Ukrainian nation, where Ukrainians realized that no matter what language we speak, no matter what religion we are, what is our ethnic background, we're all Ukrainians. Sort of kind of a true political concept of a nation, which is based on diversity, inclusion. And the more Russians invaded Ukraine, the stronger sense of our national identity has grown this time, especially during the last 3 years of the large-scale invasion, where Ukrainians realized that, yes, we are a nation, we are strong, and we have to keep on fighting, because if we don't, we will not exist.
You know, your words giving a lot of hope and positive, how Australians are still talking about Ukraine, helping Ukraine. You know, we're still on the radars up there, far away from our country. And, finally, I wanted to ask you, for a long time, going back to the United States, for a long time under President Trump, the U.S. treated Ukraine and Russia, almost as if they were equally at fault. All that talks, who attacked whom, who was first. But now that tone, it seems to be changing. Do you think Putin has used that period of uncertainty to grow stronger, especially on the global stage?
Putin has no, he's in a lose-lose situation. Putin has no way out. And he realizes that. Therefore, it's my firm belief that as long as he's alive, he will be waging this war. And this is what I'm explaining to my counterparts here in Australia and New Zealand, that all of this, talks about talks are really not worth the paper they're written on, in a way, because Putin cannot really stop this war. And this becomes clear when you fully realize and know Russia. And in Australia and New Zealand, there are very few people who understand Russia. It just traditionally not their cup of tea. They've been focusing primarily on China and the Southeast Asia and the region here. All those Soviet Kremlinologists from the past, they have kind of retired or passed away by now. So they have kind of lost their expertise, and now they're developing it. I'm encouraging both Australia and New Zealand to regain their knowledge of Russia, in a way, because Russia is an enemy and a threat, and Russia is a Pacific country which maintains a large Pacific fleet in Vladivostok. And Russians have been out here very close to Australia, And in November of last year, they've been organizing joint military naval exercises with Indonesia, which was only 1,300 kilometers away from Darwin in northern Australia. More recently, there was also a news report that Russians have requested Indonesians to provide their a military airport as a base for the Russian strategic bombers, which Indonesians have declined to accept. But the fact that there was such a request made is a very strong signal of concern to the Australian government, to the Australian defense and security circles, because it's not only China which is not trying to infringe on the security of the region, it's actually China and Russia working together, recycling the narratives and projecting power in different ways.
Yes. Okay, that was very, fulfill and interesting talk. Vasyl Myroshnychenko, the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia, was with us on Channel 24. Thank you, Vasyl.
Thanks for having me.